Well, today we want to, on this program, we want to talk about the idea of suffering. And C.S. Lewis said that pain is God's megaphone to wake up a sleeping world.
Yeah.
And and I think that too often, we look at pain as something, one, to be avoided, two, to run away from, three, that even when it comes to us, it's like, how do we just get through it? I just got to get through it. Whether that is, I just want to medicate myself, I want to distract myself,
Yeah.
versus the idea of I'm not supposed to do that. There's a reason for the pain. There's a reason. There is redemption in walking into the pain and into the suffering and into the loss, and it doesn't go away. Just because you distract yourself or medicate yourself, you don't get over it.
Yeah.
It just lingers there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really relevant right now in the coronavirus pandemic. For my generation, we haven't experienced a non-elective war. But we've never had something like this thrust upon us. We've never had a Cuban Missile Crisis. We've never had a World War II. We haven't had Vietnam. And everyone is very much holed up and wanting to just get through this and get over it very naturally. But yeah, so I think the timing is very relevant for this conversation. We're very unique in our generation to not have that much experience with pain, perhaps to not have enough experience with pain, so that when something like this does come around, we don't know how to interact with it.
Yeah, it's last year we lost Nolan's mom, my beloved Margaret. We were together 41 years, and in fact, our 40th wedding anniversary was just this last month. And so we've firsthand been walking through this intense grief journey from that loss, and it's a lesson or series of lessons that you just don't, you can't learn any other way than walking through it. We're both reading a book right now by a guy named Jerry Sittser called A Grace Disguised, and its tagline is How the Soul Grows Through Loss. And there we go.
There's the plug.
Yeah, here's a plug. And it's a marvelous book because it's well written, very concise. He had an incredibly tragic loss, and but he also goes on to talk about loss is loss, and the idea of comparing my loss to your loss is it's just silly, because when you have loss, whether it's a little loss, a big loss, whatever, you got to walk through it. You got to walk into it. There's one quote in the book that really was meaningful for me, and that is that often, we tend to want to move from the darkness to the light, and so we start chasing the sunset. But if we keep running west, we keep just getting to a place where it's always out of our reach. And then the analogy of that would be, I'm distracting myself. I'm trying to create happier moments, versus the idea that I just turn to the east and I have to walk into the darkness.
Right. So if the globe is turning this way and the sun is setting, once it's dark, the more you run west looking for the light, the more you're prolonging your night. But if you run the opposite way, if you run towards the east, straight into the direction of the darkness, the quicker the sun will rise for you. So how have you done that in your life through this loss?
Well, early on, it was just get through the day and get through the week, and then, and I was paralyzed with grief. The first couple of weeks, it's hard to get out of bed. Things that I think are real common for people that have lost a loved one like this close. But one of the things, a couple of thoughts that really helped me was one, having permission to realize I don't have to get over losing Margaret.
Yeah.
That, in fact, I will never get over losing her.
Yeah.
It's a matter of how do I move forward
Mm-hmm.
with her, and she's not here anymore.
Yeah.
And the second one was the idea that when I feel the grief coming on, I don't run from it.
Mm-hmm.
I just turn and I walk right into it, and I let it have its way with me to whatever degree, whether it's tears, whether it's moment, and I don't try to end it quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I just try to experience it fully.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in all of that, you know, God's doing something in me more as I walk into the darkness and the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And I lean more on His strength.
Mm-hmm.
Also, what's going on is I know that there's more of me dying.
Mm.
That it is in suffering and trials that there's an opportunity. It's not a given,
Mm-hmm.
but there's an opportunity for more of my flesh to die,
Mm-hmm.
so more of Christ can be formed in me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the dangers of trying to substitute things for our pain, or trying to chase the sun and just I don't want to deal with the darkness. Is you know you don't really experience the true blessing of the trial and the suffering,
Mm-hmm.
because it is the way of the cross.
Mm-hmm.
It's the passage into the kingdom.
Right. And it's also, so what are the two great commandments, right? It's to love God and with all of yourself, and to love your neighbor. And you can't do that if you love yourself most of all. If
You can't do either one of them.
You can't do either one of them if you love yourself most of all. And one of my meditations this Lent has been about, in regards to the story, the screenplay I'm writing right now, is centered on the question of who is my neighbor, which is the question Christ asked in the story of the Good Samaritan, in which you have a Jewish man who is attacked by robbers, beaten half dead. He's passed over by the priest, he's passed over by the Levite, and he is taken in and healed by a Samaritan, whom in traditional Jewish culture back then, the Jew would have not wanted a Samaritan. He would have thought himself better than the Samaritan. And the thing that I'm thinking about, that I've been thinking about, is I have been stuck for a long time on how we often need the help of the person that would be the greatest blow to our ego. The person.
Isn't it funny how God brings that around?
Yeah, but then I started to think for the first time lately about the Samaritan, and why did he stop? Why would a person stop? And why did the Levite and the priest pass him over? Clearly the Levite and the priest loved themselves and their schedule. And they weren't sensitive to this person's needs. But why was the Samaritan sensitive? What makes any of us sensitive to the needs of others? And from my experience with Mom, it's suffering.
Yeah.
He had suffered as well. If you're a Samaritan, then you would also have been beaten. You would have been spat upon. You would have been perhaps left half dead. You know what it means to suffer.
Yeah.
And how God uses suffering to make your heart more attentive to the needs of others so that you can love them more than you love yourself.
Yeah. No, I think that's part of the transformation that I've seen and felt most is I'm not the same person I was before Mom died, before Margaret passed. and my ability to enter into other people's suffering is totally different than it was before.
How would you describe your nature for your nature for entering into other people's suffering before Mom, even before her cancer came back and metastasized?
Well,
when life was comfortable.
As a minister, I always had a heart to try to give pastoral care to people that are in distress of one kind or another, and but I could do that and really care, but also kind of segment my emotions a little bit towards, when I left that situation, I didn't carry it with me. And I'd say now that's harder to do because I feel like that now it's almost impossible for me not to enter into the suffering in a way that's their suffering is more incarnational in me because of the journey that I had to walk through, and that when I leave them, God still brings them to mind, and then they make it to my prayer list out of sharing in their suffering, not out of me saying, well, I'm going to pray for you. I'm praying for you.
This is an obligation that I've spoken, and I don't want to be a hypocrite, so I guess I'll pray for you.
Yeah,
it's out of a genuine desire.
You're on my list. I got a prayer list, it's a connection, and it's a connection, that we both have, not just in going through whatever that pain is. It's a connection, I think, in that as we walk through this in a way that is to our benefit, we do become more of Christ. And so it's less of me and more of Christ, and less of them and more of Christ, and it is our connection in that death and incarnation of Christ that is a fullness that you don't get to. And like I said earlier, it's still a choice when you have the suffering or the trial or the loss. You have to walk into it.
Right.
You have to be willing to die. And you know what? The thing about it is, death always hurts. It just does.
Yeah, but one of the things I'm thinking about is so much less of the world identifies as a Christian and would say that this is Christ in me personally, or has very concrete beliefs about God, and yet at the same time we can still connect to people through suffering, through shared human experience. I'd also say, I would argue that we all have logos or conscience, with knowledge is the meaning of conscience, and knowledge in Greek is the same word used for Christ, which I would say that this whole world is a image of Him, and that each one of us are an image of Him, and we also are, what makes us human, what makes us different than the animals, is not just an aptitude for prayer or our emotional depth or our mental capacity. To me, it is that image of the Creator that is within us, and we reflect Him. And so I'd say that through our suffering, yes, we can connect with anybody, no matter what their religious beliefs are. But practically, for us, from our position, believing in Jesus, by entering into our own suffering and not running from it, in order so that we can also enter into the suffering of others, is ultimately what draws us and them
into that second part of the Great Commandment.
Yeah.
To love others as yourself.
Right, back into our Creator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for watching. We just wanted to share this. It's something that obviously we're walking through, and we know that everybody that watches this has or will walk through it. It's not a choice if we're going to have trials and loss and suffer. It's a choice as to how we deal with it and if we deal with it.
And whether or not we're willing to voluntarily enter into it in order for our soul to grow and for us to detach ourselves from our comfort. I'm going to add one last thing.
Sure.
In the book Beginning to Pray by Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, from earlier 20th century London, he was an Orthodox minister and has this amazing book on prayer. He talks about how we as humans are constantly attaching our senses to something that we can hear, pleasant music, something we can taste, something that tastes good, something that we can see, and that we're constantly trying to attach ourselves to things outside of ourselves through our senses, because if we are silent and we are quiet and we close our eyes, we get very, very anxious. Because we find, and his phrase is that we are nothing but a shaving of wood that is coiled around its own central emptiness. We find that we are empty inside. And so that is the source of our anxiety. People are very much left with themselves right now, and that has us very anxious. Just like silence does that to us, suffering does that to us as well whenever we're not given our coping mechanisms that we would so desire to deal with that suffering. So right now, while people don't have the coping mechanisms that they want to deal with this suffering that we're all sharing, our encouragement to you would be to enter into that voluntarily, to enter into that in silence, because in silence, we can begin to hear God's voice. It may be a megaphone to the world, but for each one of us, generally it's a whisper. And it's a whisper that we get after a period of silence, and often out of a period of suffering.
Thank you. Well said.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for watching. Who knows what we're going to talk about on the next program, but there's going to be a next program. So
Cool.
God bless you guys. Remember, faith, hope, and love, and the one that will continue forever is love. So God's love and God's peace be with you.